The following is an Operation Podcast production.
My mom took me to see a psychologist when I was 1. Obviously, there's a link between creativity and mental health struggles or challenges. He learned that violence got him attention. I learned that being the victim of that violence got me attention. And so we sort of became co-creators in our own abusive relationship. I use the term homeless because I didn't have a home and I was on the street occasionally and squatting and sleeping in parks and stuff like that. This long-term care facility that I got diagnosed with bipolar 2 and completely declaratively just dropped out of school. I'll live madly in order to escape madness.
There comes a certain point where it's like, okay, these are the circumstances that I've been given. How am I going to MacGyver this shit?
I only learned it in base camp, I think, afterwards, but I became, and still am, the only American to climb one of the world's highest peaks in winter. But on the descent, we got hit by an avalanche. And this is where life gets really complicated because...
Are you ready for a wild ride? I'm Alexis Artin, and I invite you to strap in because this is more than a podcast. This is Look at Me Now.
Okay, everybody. I think this might be the best podcast guest we've had. I'm just going to fucking call it. I'm calling it now. We haven't even recorded yet, but I don't know. I've got the tingles.
Let's try it.
Our spirit guides are here or something because I can feel it. Gosh, I'm even having like a hard time like introducing you properly that I feel like is warranted, but I'm going to do my best here. So we have Cory Richards here, and he's a lot of claims to fame, right? I mean, he is like a National Geographic and like worldwide, world-renowned photographer. He's like won awards. He's like an adventurist. He's like survived avalanches like at the highest peaks that any American has like ever climbed. I mean, there's like a lot of that I could say here to like introduce you and sort of give you that, you know, this is an authority that is to be trusted, right? But really what I'm so sucked in by is that he is an author. He already has a book called The Color of Everything, and his new book coming out is called Bipolar. The first is more of a literary piece, and then the second is more of a photographic piece, and they sort of merge together in this really artistic way because clearly we're sitting here with some sort of a genius. But really, what I'm so excited to bake into this conversation more than anything is this mental health advocacy, and that is what he's really leaning into now. And I feel like that's where the juice is. So let's squeeze it.
Let's squeeze it.
Let's go.
Let's squeeze the lemon. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I mean, I really, truly, I came in fangirling hard and being like, thank you so much for doing this. But really it's because I've been deep diving into who you are, your work, your messaging. And I will say that my first instinct, and I don't know why I feel compelled to say this, like first and foremost, is that you seem so fucking authentic, grounded, and, you know, I want to say like non-egoic. And of course we all have egos. Yeah. We're human. Yeah. But I feel a mirrored sense of self-checking going on with you.
Almost too much, I'd say sometimes.
I mean, but I have a deep appreciation for that because in this world that we live in so often, it goes unchecked. And I feel like it is always such a warm glow feeling when you find somebody that you're like, oh wow, I actually really trust.
Well, you can kind of when you resonate with somebody who is allowing their guard to be let down, you know, where you don't need to be posturing all the time. Yeah, authenticity is hard, right? Because as soon as we try to be authentic, we're not being authentic, and yet we live in a world that's begging for authenticity, and we use that word all the time. So it's sort of this circular, you know, mental masturbation at times, where it's like, how do I be authentic? Well, you just be.
That's right.
You know, you just
that's
be.
Right.
But that's really hard.
It's really hard. It's really hard. All of the mental health advocacy that's needed, right? Yeah. Is because it is mental gymnastics. Yeah. But I digress. I really wanted to like set the tone for everybody that is listening and, you know, maybe being introduced to you for the first time that, this is going to be a real conversation.
I hope so. I love that.
This is what we're in for. So
Those are
let's
the best
go.
ones.
Let's fucking go. So let's start out the way we do on this podcast, which is to look back. And you have such a fascinating story, and people may be listening that are already familiar with your story, but I feel like sometimes like revisiting something is, you get more from it. You know, it's like when I watch my favorite movie for the 100th time and I'm like, oh my God, I did not hear him say it that way before.
You find the Easter egg
right.
that you always miss.
1000%.
Yeah.
So I think that there's value in anybody hearing a retelling, but also for the people that are just getting to know you. I think your story just has so much value. So let's look back and let's start with like your origin story of like, literally just tell me your story as if, you know, you hadn't told it in a book and you hadn't told it on a million podcasts and on national television. Tell us your story.
I mean, yeah, you're right. It's hard because you do end up telling it. And then actually so much of what the book is about is how we get entrenched in our stories. Right. And we get stuck in them in some ways. So the way I always frame it is there are facts, you know, there's data, and then we apply the meaning. So the story I'm going to tell you it's just, these are the facts, right? And then we'll get into the meaning and sort of hopefully escaping the meaning in some ways. But I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah. I was born to parents who were avid outdoors people, which ended up both, I think, saving my life initially and then becoming in its own way a trap. I have one older brother, and he is very much the source of, he is my greatest gift, and also a guy I don't really talk to. And that's an interesting relationship and so anyway, I started skiing when I was 2. I started climbing when I was 5. And then we had this very enchanted sort of white middle class upbringing in Salt Lake. And I was a very artistic kid. And then I was a smart kid. And so I ended up going to high school 2 years early. You know, I was kind of like this straight A student on this very straight and narrow path with a little bit of flair on the side. But I was also a very, very emotional child. And part of that was tied to, I think, looking back, the creative side of me. Obviously, there's a link between creativity and mental health struggles or challenges. But to give it sort of a frame of reference, my mom took me to see a psychologist when I was 1. Which is telling, right? So she, as a mother, was saying something is like slightly, I don't know how to place it. And of course, the psychologist was like, he's 1. It's fine. Like everything's going to be okay.
I'm pretty sure I was diagnosed with magical thinking by kindergarten.
Exactly.
So I'm with you.
So I went to high school 2 years early, and then by virtue of a lot of family dynamics that were, I think, very much unseen because we sort of ticked all the boxes of the happy family, doing all the things right, good parenting, et cetera, there were these hidden family dynamics that I would come to learn about a lot later. And what happened was the relationship with my brother primarily, it's where it all manifested. And it became increasingly more and more violent. And so in hindsight, what I see there is that both of us were craving some sort of emotional connectivity that we weren't getting, which became sort of like, how can we act out in order to get those emotional needs met? He learned that violence got him attention. And I learned that being the victim of that violence got me attention. And so we sort of became co-creators in our own abusive relationship.
And for clarity, what's the age difference between the two of you?
We're only 2 years apart, but it's interesting because to me, he occupied very much an adult space in my mind.
He was the older brother.
He's the older brother.
Sure.
Yeah. And so, and also there's sibling dynamics. There's second born, firstborn.
Sure. I have 2 boys.
Yeah.
Yes. This is all ringing like real crystal clear over here.
Yeah. And how close are they?
4 years apart.
4 years apart. So there's a little more distance, which is, do you think that's healthy? Do you think that's helpful?
It remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But I think that there is an inherent competitiveness between the two of them. And it is a constant battle of who got a bigger piece of cake, who gets to watch which television, who eats faster, who gets a longer shower, a shorter shower, he gets to read, he gets mommy tonight, he gets this, he gets that. I mean, it's literally everything that they can possibly compete over is a competition.
Well, and I think that's inherent in all siblings, I think in boys especially. And because we were 2 years apart, as much as I looked at him as sort of this almost adult in my life, I was always trying to compete. And my parents, their solution in some ways, just to make it easier, was we just did all the same things. So when you're doing all the same things, there's only room for one person to be the best at those things, right? So there was a deeper level of competition that, when I talk to my friends who are parents now, I'm like, get your kids doing different shit. Because it helps them identify separately, right? Like they're their own person. But because of that and that competition and that growing turmoil that I really go deep into in the book, all of a sudden I wasn't getting good grades anymore. And because the violence at home, the chaos at home started amplifying so dramatically that I just kind of fell off a cliff. And so by the time I had finished 8th grade, I'd been in high school or taking high school classes for 2 years. I basically was almost failing out of school. And everybody around me was like, well, what has happened to this child? Meanwhile, we're sort of ignoring, or not ignoring, but just trying to navigate the elephant in the room, which is this very, very complicated relationship. Come to find out that it's all related to our parents, and it's so easy for mothers to just like blame themselves. This is not about that. It's just a hard look at, well, if this happens, then this happens, and then this happens, and it can be almost invisible. So I get diagnosed with depression, clinical depression, and they put me on Prozac. So I'm 12 when this happens. And sort of early 90s, so SSRIs are going off, right? And this is that time. We decide to put me in a private school, and about 2/3 of the way through that, I get kicked out, or asked politely to leave. And I go back to public school, and I just completely fall off the rails. And I just stop going. And my mom we're very clear that something is off. And so she takes me to sort of get assessed at Primary Children's Psychiatric Unit at the Primary Children's Hospital. And the door closes, and I just end up staying. So I've been like institutionalized. And I didn't see it coming. And so there was this shock there of sort of, you can imagine the anger, the fear, the feeling of abandonment, all of which, again, I harbored no blame for, because my parents, I really do believe, were doing the best they could. And thank God I had access to care.
Yeah.
And after a week there, I was transferred to a long-term inpatient, outpatient behavioral rehab that was based on the 12 steps. And so I was there for 8 months. I ran away 3 times. And then on the last time that I ran away, my parents were like, well, okay, but you can't come home. So for a moment,
they bottom lined you.
And I was unwilling to bend. So for a time, I didn't really have. I used the term homeless because I didn't have a home, and I was on the street occasionally and squatting and sleeping in parks and stuff like that. But for the most part, people took me in, and then I'd sort of wear out my welcome, and I'd be on the street again, and some family friends took me in Idaho. I got my GED. I remember taking the test when I was 16. Oh, and it was in this long-term care facility that I got diagnosed with bipolar 2 and put on Depakote and Wellbutrin and completely declaratively just dropped out of school. And so after this spell of sort of quasi-homelessness, I ended up living in Idaho, and I took the GED, and I remember just thinking, is that all I was supposed to fucking learn? You know what I mean? Like in high school, is that it? And I moved back to Salt Lake, could not get it together with my parents, got a full-time job. I'm 16 years old. I lose that job. I get another job. I lose that job. And finally, I've got this shitty old Subaru and I'm like, fuck it. I'm into the wilding this bitch, and I'm driving to Alaska and I'm going to live in the woods and and my car breaks down in Seattle and I end up sort of, I am reintroduced in some ways to my aunt and uncle who live there. I leave and I end up in southern Utah, deeply depressed, without a job, living in this strange house in this town called Parowan, which is like one of those crazy little towns on the side of the interstate that you drive through.
That you drive through and you go, who lives there?
Who lives there?
Yeah.
And I remember the smell of this house that I lived. I just remember it. It was so, ugh. And I came back to Salt Lake. My brother and I get in another fight. He's 19 at this point. I'm 17. And I end up back in the hospital. And the hospital says, well, we've got this great program that you should send your child to. And they tell my parents to send me back to the same program I was already in. And my parents were like, something about this system is fucked. Did they even read the file? And so for the first time in a long time, I remember somebody asking me what I wanted. Like, what do you want? What do you need? Instead, and I think that's something that we put this on our, we think we know best, and oftentimes we do, but sometimes they're fully baked humans that have real valuable insights. And I said, I want to go back to Seattle. So I ended up back in Seattle with my aunt and uncle. And something about that environment, I became deeply Christian, which I'm not any longer, but it was a place where I could belong.
Yes.
Because I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. I didn't have school. I didn't have a place with my family. So there was this community that sort of held me for a time. And it was during that time that I rediscovered climbing. And I rediscovered sort of this love for the outdoors. And my uncle said, I got 3 jobs and I could hold them all. He made me pay him half every paycheck for rent and stuff. And then at the end of this 8-month period with them, he said, I'll give you all your money back if you choose an experience to spend it on. And I chose to go climbing. And I asked my mom if she had a camera, and she loaned me her point and shoot. It was a 1984 point and shoot Ricoh camera. And I went climbing and I started taking pictures. And that was sort of the genesis. That's the early life story. And that spun forward very quickly. I ended up going back to university for a short time, at which point I was working again and I was saving all my money, and I'd go on these little, summer break would come, spring break would come, and I'd go on these trips. I'd just save money and go climbing and take pictures. And then I started submitting those pictures. And I decided to go study abroad, submitting those pictures to publications. I decided to go study abroad, and I ended up in Salzburg, Austria, and I met a guy named Andrew Phelps. I showed him my pictures and he was like, you should do this. And so that set the photography heavily in motion. Climbing was a complement to that because it was something that a lot of people can't do or don't do. And so it was a very unique skill set that allowed me to take pictures. And then that's what I did for 10 years. And I got better at climbing. I got more pictures published. I became a professional climber, professional athlete, sponsored by the North Face, all these different climbing companies. And then I started getting asked to go on these bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger trips. And that was sort of my entree into the National Geographic world. And this is very condensed. I know I'm actually being long-winded with it, but it's very condensed.
Well, I as life is, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there are so many nuances and so many moments, and I'm sure each one of those moments that you barely touched on has a depth. Other book you could
like a
write
universe
about it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's good to just get a sense of the journey. And it's interesting because you touched on something really profound and important in the overarching theme of this, which is in that journey, you had this, personal discovery, right? And it was almost like you had to strip away all of the hijacking you had done of, oh, this is who I am, this is who I'm not, this is what I deserve, this isn't what I deserve, this is what I want, this isn't what I want. This is, it's a constant, and it's funny that you're an adventurer and that you spend so much time outdoors, because I really do see us as almost like a mountainside that is constantly being carved, right? Eroded, weathered by our environment, right? It's like we are the substance, but the substance of us is not impervious to the conditions that we're in. And so often we will take the shape of that conditioning.
100%. And I mean, there's exactly to your point here. There's so much in that upbringing around mental health that gets sort of immediately from one, there's this story of something is wrong with me. Something's wrong, right?
Something's broken. Something is inherently damaged. Like this product should be sent back.
Exactly. And then there's this narrative of, basically, I mean, you spin that forward and you talk about going to rehab, and there's this whole discussion about the troubled teen industry right now. And is it really healthy? Is it helpful? Because so often what teens learn in those environments is not that they're like very valuable kids, which is really that's the inspiration behind trying to help them. But really what they're learning is something's really fucked up with them. Something's really wrong with them. And what gets left out of that is that we are a daisy chain of family dynamics. So to ask a child to rectify behavior and then sending them back into an environment that hasn't been addressed, and you're talking about parental issues, parents understanding and unwinding their trauma, understanding how their decision-making is impacting their kids. When you ask a kid to go back into an environment that hasn't been examined, I say it's like treating somebody for like third-degree burns and then asking them to walk back into a house fire. Like, what do you think is going to happen? It doesn't change. And so
generational trauma.
It's generational trauma. It's our
patterns of that generational trauma, and to pivot our own experience and what experience we are giving to those that are coming after us.
Well, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I think there's steps of this empowerment journey, right? It is empowering to learn that you are a product of your environment. It is empowering to learn what trauma is and what your specific trauma might look like. Then it's empowering to step out of it, right? So it's a spectrum where I think a lot of people, as we learn about our trauma, we think that that's healing. Learning about the trauma is only the first step. Being able to identify it is wonderful, but then so often that becomes our story.
Yes, and we get stuck reliving it and re-traumatizing ourselves and going into dysregulation rather than taking that information and using it almost like we would an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Right? Making it sort of this autopsy without blame.
Right.
Right? As they talk about
Autopsy without blame.
It's in the book Good to Great.
Oh, that's Brene Brown?
No, it's Gary Vaynerchuk, and it's a business book.
Oh, Good to Great. Good to
Yes.
Great. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, it's
was that Jim Collins? Good to Great.
Oh no, you're right. It was Jim Collins.
Yeah.
It was Jim Collins.
Look at us.
Credit
Jesus.
amended.
Yeah.
Credit amended. Look at us.
Look at us.
But it was this really great way of framing something in business that can correlate to anything in your life, of being able to go, my past, if I could regard it like an encyclopedia, where I am a scientist.
It's just data.
Who is not making this emotional.
Right.
I'm retrieving data so that I can take these algorithms.
Yeah.
Right? And I can make a new equation moving forward based on the data, not making it, oh, this means something about who I am because my mother or my father or my grandmother experienced what they experienced and I am caged by it.
Well, I think it's sort of like neo-stoicism, right? Where you're looking at it, it's like, think you are harmed and you will be, think you are not harmed and you won't be. That's a little too reductive. Neo-stoicism would say that you have to discharge the emotion first. You have to take the charge out of the emotion, which means that you have to validate it and then move through it, which is part of understanding what our, and I mean, we could talk a lot about triggers, but I don't really love that word, but it is understanding triggers are just a roadmap, right?
Yes.
We need them. We need to get fucking triggered. I don't like this culture.
They are signals on a dashboard.
Exactly. It's like, that's just data. They're invitations into stuff that's still bothering us.
Yes.
And so that to me is what's so important about this journey of empowerment. What I say is psychology and this general ethos of psychology has both hamstrung us and also is necessary to empowerment. The idea is that psychology is an invitation out of victimhood, not into it. But so often right now, what happens is we get sucked into our own victimhood.
Yes.
And we're living in a culture that rewards victimhood.
Yes. And that harkens to, I was listening to you on somebody else's podcast, and I would love to give it credit. So maybe I'll put it in the show notes or something. But he was talking about the commercialization of trauma.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah.
And I was like, oh wow, that's such a poignant conversation in terms of, particular to your experience, but I think for all of us, that we just can't turn away from a train wreck. And
we love the train wreck.
We love the train wreck.
We're genetically designed to love the train wreck.
And I'm just going to take this to the next place of how we will internalize that, how we will gawk at our own trauma to the point where we're not willing to, where there's almost a secondary gain to holding on to it versus releasing it.
Because it allows us to be in victimhood. Yes. And victimhood, quite frankly,
comes with its benefits. It does. And by the way, this is not to,
discount.
Yes, major caveat here.
Yeah.
This is not to discount anybody who is suffering, anybody who has been victimized, complex trauma on the spectrum, from the smallest little infraction all the way to the major stuff.
Totally.
But this is and also acknowledging the privilege to be able to have access to resources that have been helpful and beneficial.
That is such a huge point, because I want to make this caveat too.
Yes.
Is this is not to discount people's real trauma. Being a victim is very different than living in victimhood.
Correct. Right? And I love that distinction, because I think we're both sitting in the same camp on this.
Yeah. Terrible shit happens.
Yes.
And it needs to be recognized.
1,000%.
Yeah.
And I just, it's such a deep mission that I feel like we might share here.
Totally.
Of wanting people, no matter their walk of life, no matter their level of privilege, no matter the amount of resources they have, to have a glimmer of seeing the light at the end of the proverbial tunnel, that coming out of trauma is the goal, and coming out of a sense of victimhood, if you've been victimized, is possible. And, it is sort of like how you've climbed these mountains one step at a time. but it is possible.
It's possible, and it's probable if you're, in fact, it's almost inevitable if we take the invitation to really get very honest about it and start gently peeling back the attachment to it, because it's sticky. There's a residue to trauma, and the whole point of empowerment is moving beyond its story, that we're somehow in deficit because of it. There's, look, it's not your fault that it happened. It's not, whatever it is, it's not your fault, but it ends up being our responsibility, whatever it is. And that is one of the fundamental fucking hurdles of life, because I don't want to take responsibility for getting T-boned at an intersection for somebody that ran a red light because they were texting. But unfortunately, it's going to be me who has to deal with the insurance, take the car to the shop, get it fixed, or I can drive around in a busted car.
Heal any injuries.
Right.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It's going to be my responsibility. And I can stay angry at it, or I can engage with the process. But it's, again, the other thing I wanted to say that's so important is that the discussion around privilege is I think it's so vital that we understand what we're talking about when we say privilege in the context of mental health. Privilege in the context of mental health is access to resources and care.
Correct.
It is not about a discriminate racial, gender, any of that. Mental health is indiscriminate. It does not care.
No, it does not.
It does not give a shit. So the privilege is the access to resources and care.
Yes. Yes. There is a propensity for certain environments to spawn
more trauma. For
absolutely.
Sure. And that is related to
absolutely
resources.
Absolutely. And, I think there's also something that's come up for me recently with one of my children, is this awareness around, how this all starts, how this all percolates, even in the best of possible circumstances.
Totally.
I think that my children live a very charmed life.
Yeah.
Nobody escapes having different levels of challenges and difficulties and traumas, right? Capital T, lowercase t.
Yeah.
But, it's so interesting how we learn to take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? Whether that is, accepting certain labels that get put on us, accepting certain conditions that we think, limit us, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But I see my son and I'm like, oh, okay, he isn't really capable of self-soothing. And I'm going to put yet at the end of that sentence.
Of course.
But
he hasn't developed the skills to self-soothe to this point.
And I remember even as infants, this concept of, do you let them cry through the night so that they learn to self-soothe? Do you keep going in? And where is the line of teaching them how to self-soothe? And at that age, are they even capable of self-soothing? Like, what are they really doing in their nervous system to be able to self-soothe themselves? So anyway, in modern day times, my oldest son is 10 years old. And I see that I'm like, oh, wow, he really hasn't found a way to self-soothe. And how catapult that to me working with adult clients who still don't know how to self-soothe.
Right.
And how it becomes addictive behavior.
Right. So I would offer, and tell me what you think, he probably does know how to self-soothe, but they're maladaptive strategies.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So I say self-soothe as a coach that's going like
healthy self-soothing.
These are the healthy self-soothing techniques. Right. The constructive ones versus the destructive ones, however you want to frame it. But, I see that it's like, oh, I'm going to turn to food. Oh, I'm going to turn to screens, at his age, those are the things that they're turning to. Right. I'm going to turn to a tantrum. I'm going to, and where I'm going to rip and break things or whatever.
I'm going to distract. I'm going to jump.
Right.
From
I'm
one
going to
thing
attack
the
my
next.
brother. I'm going to, these things, right? But when we get into the adulthood of it, and there's still so many of us that cannot sit with, we get back to this idea of authenticity. We cannot sit with the truth. We cannot sit with the discomfort, right? So we do become addicted. And whether that is addicted to the victimhood, addicted to drugs, addicted to food, addicted to screens, addicted to sex, name it, right?
Yeah.
And there is such a thread that goes through the whole story, right? That goes through, I've heard you even say before, and I agree with you, like the trauma of birth, like the trauma of things that happen when you're in utero, right? The generational trauma that is, encoded, whatever you want to say about whatever you believe in terms of, what's traumatic and what isn't. But then you come into this world that is filled with a need for you to be resilient.
Yeah.
A need for you to be resourceful in terms of how do I take care of myself when all of the conditions around me are violent?
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly that, where because there was chaos in that adolescent time and because there was violence, my self-soothing was very maladaptive in the way that I developed. I think of ADHD more as a developed condition. I'm more of the Gabor Mate style. People are sort of laying this at the feet of genetics. I don't think that's necessarily, I don't totally agree with that. I'm not going to speak as a clinician or a scientist. I have it's harder for me. I see that as an adaptive strategy to escape stress. And what I also learned is that by going into these chaotic environments, high stress, high stimulation, high consequence environments, it was what I knew, it was where I was comfortable. Because growing up in an environment where I didn't know where I was going to sleep, where I didn't know what the next violent thing was going to be, where I didn't learn any sort of future forecasting. So it's kind of like, high risk is what worked for me. And beyond that, there was this idea that, there was always this sense that I was going to go crazy. If I didn't take these drugs, if I didn't do these things, I was going to go crazy. And so I sort of was like, all right, fuck it, then I'll live crazy. And it was my way of, in the book I say, well, all right, I'll live madly in order to escape madness, and I'll risk my life in order to save it.
Yeah.
And sort of there's this reactionary nature of everything where feeling that caging as a child, well, how do you think I was going to live beyond that as an adult? Completely uncaged, completely unboundaried, completely for better and worse, right?
And that is the essence of bipolar, right? It's guardrail to guardrail. It's
guardrail to guardrail, and it's an inability quite often to control or even see that happening.
Yes.
And, it's, and I see it now so much more clearly. At the time, I'd just make these snap decisions, super impulsive. I'm doing this now. And people would be looking at me like, what? Or I would be so hyper-focused on things that it would be, to break that focus would be a violent reaction on my part. An emotionally violent reaction on my part. And so gravitating towards environments that allowed me to live in that space and also were an outlet for all that angst, became, again, a self-soothing process that actually only added stress. Right?
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, first of all, in attachment theory, of course, you went towards what was uncomfortable but familiar. Right. In going into these extreme environments. But, I really see bipolar as someone who is in an extreme cycle of balance.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It is like,
that's great.
I am going to go, all the way down into the dark, and then I'm going to regulate by going all the way back up to the light, and then I'm going to dip all the way back down into the dark. And as dark as you go is as light as you go, right? So that's the extreme nature of it.
Yeah.
But really, it's a dance of balance.
It's an attempt at balance that becomes very imbalanced, right? And that's one of those dualities that's so...
Because they're not able to coexist, or at least the experience of it isn't them coexisting. It is, I'm all the way down here and this feels unattainable. Or I'm all the way up here and this feels unattainable. And for those who can't see me, my hands are in opposing positions.
But what's interesting too, and this is, so I want to give a little bit more of a history, because we just went really deep into theory and which I love. Because that's where my mind I love that thought process. As I got to I was 29, I got asked to go on this expedition to Pakistan in the winter to climb one of the world's 8,000 meter peaks in winter. So Everest is the highest. There are 14 of these mountains on the planet, 14 mountains that stand above 8,000 meters. The death rate across all 8,000 meter peaks is just under a quarter. So like just under 1 in 4 people who go and do these things die, that's a high death toll. I think might boast the highest death rate of any sport, aside from maybe base jumping. I don't know. And so I went in winter, and on February 2nd, I didn't know this at the time. I only learned it in base camp, I think, afterwards, but I became, and still am, the only American to climb one of the world's highest peaks in winter. But on the descent, we got hit by an avalanche. And this is where life gets really complicated, because to this point, I was sort of going through my 20s on this high of just like doing, making, and sort of using both the activity of climbing and the expression through photography as a way to make my mark in the world, because there was this deep narrative of, I don't really fucking matter, right? Like I don't matter. How could I be on the streets and matter? That's incongruous, right? Like it doesn't make sense. And photography was this way to it was like a concrete proof that I had a place in the world. It's
physical matter that energetically means I matter.
Yeah, it's exactly. You said it better than I've ever been able to articulate it. And so we get hit by this avalanche. Then there's 3 of us. We all survive. I turn the camera on myself and I start crying. And then about an hour later, I took a photo of myself. And that photo ended up being printed on the cover of National Geographic. And it was also, so then my career just launches. It's just like the bell curve just goes nearly vertical, right? And at the same time, it was like all of those little T traumas and the complex post-traumatic stress of a violent childhood, a very chaotic childhood, which, by the way, was also marvelous, right? It's like dumping water on that. All those little seeds now just blossom. And that's what is generally called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or acute post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I get married and I do all, and then my life, just like this internal life that I'm living. And this took years and years and years. It took basically a decade of trying and failing to live in integrity, to align the actions that no one saw with what everybody saw, right? And bring down the perception of what everybody saw to a realistic level so that I could actually live in alignment with what I wanted. And at the same time, this is that same place where I'm learning all the language of psychology and trauma. And now I was talking about it. And this is when I sort of stepped into becoming a mental health advocate. But I knew the words, and now we're back on that trajectory of empowerment where I knew the fucking words and I knew how to articulate it, but I was still hiding behind it.
You weren't embodying it.
I wasn't embodying it. I wasn't integrating it. I just knew how to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so people start lauding all this sort of, oh, you're doing so much. And I was, but there was also a deep feeling of inauthenticity existing while people were saying I was so authentic. And that became its own sort of, authentic and vulnerable became its own way to be inauthentic and caged and completely not vulnerable. And that's where I think the conversation gets really interesting when we talk about a culture of trauma where we're using it as a shield and we're using vulnerability to hijack connection and hide behind the issues.
Preach.
And I mean, it's just so fascinating the way that happens.
And it's rampant.
It's rampant. It's rampant. You go on, and when I was single and dating in LA, you go on these dates and it's basically two people trauma dumping.
Trauma bonding.
And trauma bonding. Like,
yeah.
Here it all is. Here's all my baggage. When this person hasn't earned the trust to hold
Not at
that.
all. Earned the right to your story.
Exactly.
As Brene would say, yes.
And so we're just dumping it all on people, hoping to hijack connection and create a quick bond that makes us feel somehow whole, which is really just a salve for the shit that we haven't resolved inside. And to the point of that, like even being a survivor is still, you're still in the process of empowerment. It feels very empowering to be a survivor, but even that word keeps you chained to the trauma. Mm-hmm. You're still identifying with the trauma.
Yes.
It's just and then how do you say at this point where I'm sitting here talking about it, well, how is it different? And the only thing I can say is that embodiment is a personal experience. And when you start to do it, you know it, but you can't tell externally until you've started to go down that road. And then you can start to identify when people are stuck in the story, but most people can't. So, you know what I mean? Sorry, that was a lot. That was a fucking lot.
I'm here for a lot. And,
I'm calling myself out there.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that it takes a lot. It requires a lot to get to the truth because there's so much untruth that we have to filter through. Right? There's so much that we have taken on as truth that isn't even conscious to us that we've taken on as truth, let alone the stuff that we, gaslight ourselves over or whatever, right? But it's like there is in each one of us, if you really dive down in there, right? Like a center of truth and wisdom that is untouched by anyone or anything else, right? And that I really lean into that space a lot in terms of, that's the only place that is uninterrupted between me and the divine, right? Me and God, me and the universe, me and the collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it, right? And that's where the truth lives. And I can't begin to tell you how many people try to interrupt and disrupt that, whether it's on Instagram, whether it is, in my closest relationships, because everybody is navigating, the dysfunction or the dysregulation that they have experienced in their journeys. And, you said something early on in the conversation, and I think it was for my benefit, and I appreciate it, where you said, it's not the mother's fault, right? Because I think I had said something about my kids or whatever. And I feel like you're right. It's not the mother's fault. I mean, it partially is the mother's fault and it's partially not. But I feel like this is something actually that I've been wanting to say to parents out there. And I think this is a good opportunity and invitation to say it, which is so often we do as parents take on the onus of, oh my God, what did I do to my child? Oh my God, I'm the worst parent. Oh my God, whatever it may be. And what we don't often do is accept that child, just like I said, I have my own relationship with the divine. Like I have my own agreement, my own soul contract of what it is that I'm here to do. And I've called in a lot of these challenges that I have experienced in my life. And I know that I've heard you say this before, that, the explosiveness that you have in your relationship with your brother is your greatest gift, right? That he's been your greatest guide, right? there is so much that happens in our lives that is, I believe, inherently balanced. And oftentimes we only see one side of that. We create a narrative that supports our values or the values that we've hijacked from other people so that we can live in a story about it. But the truth of the matter is, I believe that everything is balanced, inherently balanced. And it's just about allowing yourself to reveal the nature of that balance in each moment, right? So as parents, it's about understanding that that is true for your child, that at a certain point, there is nothing that you can do. That person is their own person.
Yeah.
As young as they may be. It doesn't mean take your hands off the wheel as a parent.
No.
There's inherent responsibilities that you have for sure. But you also have to trust that whatever that child is going through, to a certain extent, that's their journey and it has nothing to do with you. So parents, stop taking all over responsibility. Right? For and trying to over control something that is not to be controlled.
Well, and I think there's certain things that parents very much can control and things that they very much can't. And I think what you're talking about is that deep, like, this is a full human. When they come out of you, they're a full human. There's a Jess Lair quote that says, and I use it in the book, children are not things to be molded, but people to be unfolded.
Yes, beautiful.
And I love that idea. What parents can control is, or to some degree, is the stories that they're imparting consciously and unconsciously on their children, and the meaning that they're giving their children about certain events, or even about their full personhood. For example, this is one that I always, and again, I don't blame. There's literally, and this is one of the ways where I kind of knew that I was actually starting to embody this stuff. I remember waking up and being like, I don't feel any blame, like none. I just don't feel blame toward, like, my parents are just my parents trying to figure it out. Shit happened, and then it's just data now. But one of the things that I remember experiencing was this narrative of, you don't know how much we do for you boys. You don't know how much. And so a child can very easily feel there's a subtle messaging there that they're a burden.
Inherent guilt.
There's this inherent, and I had a therapist who was really marvelous. She said to me one time, she's like, I want to teach my child gratitude, but I would never expect my child to be grateful for the things that I give them. Because, and it was like a revelation to me, where she's like, she's like, it is not, I chose to have this child, and constantly reminding them of how good they have it, how is actually, I can teach that through a different lens, but constantly reminding of how much I do for them, how grateful they should be. Actually, there's a very subtle messaging where the child, at least in my case, is going, well, I didn't ask for this.
Absolutely. And look, there is subtle messaging in everything. Gosh, I remember my mom, I used to date this guy who worked at a pizza shop.
Yeah.
And I was so in love with him.
Yeah. And the pizza was good.
And the pizza was good. Oh, so you can't go wrong here, right?
Yeah.
I used to sit at his pizza shop all day and just watch him make pizza. I would just stare at him with hearts in my eyes, heart emojis.
Did he stare back?
And when he wasn't making pizza.
Yeah.
And I remember my mom saying to me, I love you, Mom. I know you're doing your best. But I remember my mom saying to me, honey, I just don't think you should go to the pizza shop anymore. And I said, well, but why?
Yeah.
And she's like, well, don't you think he's going to get sick of you? And she was doing it from such a place of love, right? She was afraid that I was going to get my heart broken because I was being too available and I was being too needy or whatever, right? It was coming from such a place of her mama bear wanting to protect me, right? But what is the underlying message there? I'm someone that people get sick of.
Yeah. Yeah. You're too much.
Right? And again, we're, as parents, we want to protect our kids, and it's going to come out sideways.
Right.
Right? But wasn't there such a beautiful also message in that where I went, well, hold on a second. Do I believe I am someone that people can get sick of?
Right.
That's the work.
Right.
That's where it lives.
And it usually comes much later. after the
Hello.
stories have taken you
After you
down a
become a
rabbit
master
hole.
embodiment coach and a life
right,
coach,
right,
because
right,
all
right.
you want to do all day is work on this stuff.
Right.
Because you've seen the light, so to speak. But I mean, it is going to, we are all human. So it is going to happen, and it is going to happen constantly. And that's why I think the advocacy work of empowerment comes back to, there is only one person whose opinion that matters, and it's yours. And how do we get back to that place where we're in command of that opinion and we're not outsourcing it all the time?
And how do we, I love that. How do we not outsource it? Like it can't be outsourced. It actually can't be. What so happens so often is we mistake attention for love, right? And we think that, and that attention is very satiating, and especially in LA and these environments where, celebrity culture is rampant. We think that followers or whatever is somehow validation of our personhood, when in fact that if you are outsourcing it that way, it's like a false bill of sale. Somebody's paying you in bad money.
Yes.
You
well,
can't take it to the
I say
bank.
all the time, like, we always try to measure our energy in terms of physical matter. Right. So it's like, I want to, for guys, it's a dick measuring contest. Right. But, it's like, well, what does the number on the scale say? What's the size of my bra?
Yeah.
How many followers do I have?
What's
how
the
much,
number of
how
my
many
bank
decimals
account?
are in my bank account?
Yeah.
Right. It's all
Yeah.
these like, material measurements versus but we're using those measurements to determine our energetic value.
Right.
Where our energetic value isn't measurable. So you're trying to actually use a measurement system that doesn't work.
Right.
To measure something that is immeasurable.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself.
And how do we come back to this place where we go, oh, I have infinite value, and it's not measurable. And going back to this idea of like, I'm even trying to measure it by outsourced values. Like we've gotten so far off the reservation that how are we to ever come back? It would make it, I say this flippantly with like air quotations in the air and like a wink in my eye of like, it would make anybody bipolar.
Yeah. Well, and that's something else that I've just going back to diagnoses is these stories that get laid on us. They're just information, but like, what 14-year-old child isn't bipolar?
Hello.
It was.
I call my 10-year-old Jekyll and Hyde half the time. I really do. I'm like, oh my God, you are the sweetest little human I've ever like encountered in my entire life. And then 5 seconds later, I'm like, you are the biggest a-hole.
Yeah.
How is it even possible that you are the same human being that I was just talking to 5 minutes ago? What is going on here?
It's so true. And it's the hormones, and it's like the world.
It's all the things. And I literally couldn't love that human being any more than I possibly do. But it really is fascinating to see this little person, like, who I like made in my body become, go through all of these stages of like figuring out who he is and then splitting into these two different, he is a Gemini. I'll say that. He's two humans in one right now.
It's culture, like you said. I think our culture right now specifically is actually almost creating certainly a culture of ADHD children, which I'm also like, well, I'm not sure diagnosing kids with ADHD is really that helpful. It's like we're saying, well, your 8 or 10-year-old child has trouble sitting still in class, and I'm like, yeah, because
he doesn't have trouble sitting still in front of video games for 8 hours. I'll tell you that.
And we're really not designed to sit still for 8 hours. Like video games sort of hijack that system, but we're at 10 years old. We're supposed to be out. That's how we evolved. We were in constant motion. Yeah. Learning was interactive. It was learning by doing. It was, and the intellectuals self-selected. It doesn't mean the kids that are out breaking sticks over other trees are not smart, but there's a certain amount of energy that is just part of it's inherently part of who we are. We are primates.
Yes.
And we're supposed to be out moving and interacting. So there's that. But I think children too are, the culture that we live in, to your point, is that we are in a constant stress response all the time.
Yes.
And that's the culture that we've developed. Whether it's the 24-hour news cycle or social media, it's a constant culture of comparison. Am I enough? Do I belong?
Yes.
Is the world going to end? Climate change, war, whatever it happens to be. So we're creating a culture of fear. So we're constantly thinking that there's a bear chasing us, when there is no bear chasing us. So we're living in our sympathetic nervous system, which is causing all sorts of hormonal shifts. And then we're diagnosing people. My friend Lauren Taus, who's an incredible psychedelic therapist, she says we're diagnosing sick fish in toxic water.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so our children are predisposed to be reactive because they live in an environment that has them constantly in fight or flight, constantly. And that's true for us too. So that reactivity is almost to be expected, right? And because you're living in your amygdala.
Yes. And reintroduce this idea of self-soothing, right? Reintroduce this idea of where's the balance in this?
Yeah.
How are we cultivating the balance?
What do you do? How do you self-soothe in the moment? What are your techniques?
I have so many different techniques and I will rifle through them because sometimes one works immediately and other times I have to try like 6 or 7 different techniques.
Right.
But for me, I always come back to the body. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that I don't have mental things that I go through. I absolutely do. Like a mental thing, for example, would be what would unconditional love say in this moment?
Oh, wow. Beautiful question.
Right.
Wow, that's
so
gorgeous.
Like going back to, okay, I'm way too in my animal body, my animal nature that lives in fear and is looking for the threat and is looking for, it is literally we live in an animal body and our animal body is always looking for where's the predator, where's the prey? How am I going to stay safe? How am I going to stay alive? Mm-hmm. Whereas our spiritual being, our spiritual self, our energetic essence versus our physical matter lives in total trust because it's energy, which is neither created nor destroyed. It just changes form. So it's not looking for any threat. It's not looking for anything destructive. It doesn't even understand fear, right? Or an end.
But how do you lead clients back to that first touch? Do you remember when you first touched that we talk about the heart space, right? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people...
I already know where you're going. Inner child work. So for me, the first time that I tasted the nectar of...
Like your pure essence.
I am love.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not here for anything other than love. Mm-hmm. To be love, to give love, to receive love. Mm-hmm. And it was going back to, one of my early childhood traumatic experiences and seeing my healthy adult self coming in and being the source of unconditional love for that child in the moment that it needed it and didn't have it. So
it sounds similar in some ways to like internal family systems, like
absolutely.
IFS work,
Absolutely. Parts work, call it whatever you want.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just the foundation. I have one tattoo on my body and it is the name of my inner child on my wrist. Aww. It's the only one I have because she's number one. And so it always comes back to her. Everything comes back to her because she's oftentimes the one that's sneaking in the driver's seat and going, I'm going to take over here. Yeah. And I'm going to just avoid every pothole of possible fear in our way. And I'm jerking the car all over the place. And I'm like, no, I just want to take a nice ride to that beautiful sunset over there. Can you get in the back seat, please, and put your seatbelt on? And I've got this. Thank you very much.
It's again, this is a Lauren Taus-ism, but she says, because there's so much wisdom, there's a reason that inner child wants to take the wheel. Of course. Right?
Its job is to protect you. It learned its lesson and it never wants to repeat it.
Exactly. And Lauren, I love this line. She says, our youngest parts are our oldest parts.
Absolutely.
And so there's a tremendous amount of wisdom, but they need their own sort of parenting, right? And
I use the analogy a lot of times too with people. I'm like, our fear is like a bodyguard.
Yeah.
And it stands in front of us. And instead of, you imagine a bodyguard that's like, facing out towards the world, right?
Yeah.
And going like any threat coming our way, I will take care of it. You just do you, boo. You get big back there. You do
Yeah.
you, right? But instead, oftentimes our bodyguard is turned in towards us, guns blazing, and going like, get small. Don't make a move that could threaten us. Don't bring attention over here.
Wow, that's
And be good, and I will not have to fire. But if you start causing a stir back here, I'm going to have to take care of business.
It's like friendly fire in a way. It's like
1,000%, but unintentional friendly, but intentional.
Yeah,
it really is. And so it's the work of like turning that bodyguard around and saying, no, I get to do me as big and loud as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And, anybody else who's coming at me, then we can constructively direct your energy there.
Yeah.
Right. And, again, it really all comes back to balance. It comes back to being aware of where there is dark, there will always be equal light. And are you seeing both? And where are you, are you too far in your animal body, or are you too far in your spiritual self? Are you too far in the mania? Or are you too far in the depression? Are you, it's everything is a constant dance of understanding that both are always equally present. We can't get rid of one side of life.
So the title of the book, The Color of Everything, is about exactly that. Meaning that, and I won't give away what was happening, but there was a moment where sort of everything dissolved, like the beginning and end of things dissolved. And I saw that that the black and white that made me feel so safe in the world didn't exist, because it just happens in shades of gray. Literally all of life is a yes and. All of life is a yes and.
Yes.
Every single thing is a yes and. And that's so hard for some people because they're like, well, what about this? This is clearly a hard no. And you're like, I get it. And when you take it fully it doesn't mean you can excuse something abhorrent. I'm just saying there's context to everything, which muddies the black and white.
You can only have a hard no if there's a hard yes. One can't exist without the other.
And exactly. And they're usually not a hard no or a hard yes once you introduce the other.
Correct.
I also like Ryan Holiday said something about like, I hate this if it's not a fuck yes, it's a fuck no culture. Because he said, and I'm slaughtering it, he's like, every major decision I've ever made in life has been like a 48-52. If you're not scared about making huge life decisions, that's good. Or if you're not scared, that's bad. That's bad, right? Like that is, whew. Because
there's a diagnosis in that.
Yeah, like you need like this whole fuck yes, fuck no culture makes things so binary that it makes no space for the reality of life. So we're looking for these hard fuck yeses.
The fluidity of life, right?
And they very, very, very rarely exist. So we think that something's wrong when, for example, we get into a relationship that's really mostly good, and yet we're tepid, you know?
It is only our soul that will bring in a sense of certainty.
Totally. And I think that ambiguity is empowerment.
Yes,
Being
absolutely.
comfortable with the complexity.
Yes.
That two things that seem to be opposing are existing at the same time, and being like, ooh, this is uncomfortable, but I'm going to hold it. That's empowerment.
And self-soothe in the discomfort,
right,
rather than self-harm.
Exactly. That's such a good...
Mentally, emotionally, physically.
But I think it takes a huge leap for people to really come into contact with their nervous system and arrest it, or not arrest it, but validate it in the moment, at least initially, and go, even just being, people go, well, how do you start to do this work? And I always say, just notice.
Be an observer.
What's happening in your body. at the point of contact with somebody, at the point of contact.
That's the beginning.
With the environment. Are you heightened? Do you feel closed? What's your body language telling you? What's your nonverbal communication telling you? That's your nervous system.
Yep.
Communicating.
That's your animal body. That's right.
And so just
your
notice
animal
it.
body is your number one feedback system for the purpose of your soul being in it.
100%. And it's relational. Everything is relational to the input that's coming in.
And how are you embodying these psychic wounds?
Right.
That we've been talking about. So, gosh, I mean, we could just continue to.
Did we go to the future? Did we go to the? We didn't We
did.
Okay,
We actually did, because we talked about the past, and it really it helped us imbue a conversation about the present. And now we're just going to look at the future and tell me what you see. Like, what is down the horizon for you? What is on the timeline as you face forward?
Well, I mean, there's the immediacy of the timeline, which is, I always say this, I'm learning how to be loved, and I'm learning what being in love actually means. Like, I was sitting, I do a lot of men's work, as you do in LA. And we can
we
make
didn't
fun
even
of
talk
it.
about polarity. Oh
my
gosh. We got to get into that.
So, and I was, I'm with this incredible woman who there's like, she's just incredible. And there's still fear around it, right?
Sure.
And we're moving through all of that. But, so what's next, in some ways, what I see in the future is coming into contact with all that relationship brings up in me, right? And what I bring up in her, and learning to be in love. And what I really don't like that question where I'm like, okay, well, I love him, but are you in love? What I hear there is an inquisition into the lust and that fiery everything, right? The way I think of being in love is being in the container of love. It's okay if sometimes you don't feel that animal. That's gonna wane regardless. It'll come back if you're skillful at creating it. You can foster that
A la
that
mating in
animal.
captivity. Yes.
Right. You can make it if you're skillful.
Sure.
But being in love, to me, and what I'm learning about being in love, is being in the container of love. And that when you're there, you're in the dance of interaction and action as the primary meaning of love, as a verb, right? Being in love is in that container. And so it's learning that, and it's learning how to be loved, learning how to be in love. And that's just one thing. And then there's the career
And
stuff
trusting love.
trusting
love.
yourself, which is trusting yourself, right? So
Yeah, trusting love as in and of itself as a whole, because we learn so much about love from so many different places.
yeah.
And it's not always easy to trust love, just as a generic idea.
Well, it's not always easy to trust, period.
Period.
I mean, because
yes.
you're asking, like, what do I see facing right now? Honestly, there's these 2 books. I've given birth to 2 books.
Yes.
In this year. And I've left sort of the climbing and professional athletics. That I left that about 3 years ago. There was a big stripping back of identity and finding the I am in all of this, not I am a,
Yes.
I am that, I am the, but just simply I am.
Yes.
And so there's a tremendous amount of uncomfortable ambiguity in my own path right now, where I'm like, I don't really know. And I know people will say, well, if you don't know where you're going, I can't take you home. And also, that's okay. We always want to have this direct, I'm going to be this, I'm going to, manifestation. Great. I know all that's there. I know where, I'm already there. I'm just not there yet.
Well, what I see is somebody who's wilding, but in a way that's much more aligned for them.
Yeah. Wilding intentionally instead of
aligned.
Yeah. So
it's an aligned wilding versus a wilding that isn't a fit for your soul anymore.
Yeah. So that's what I see in the future.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, I'm right. I'm all here for it. I think this is like,
it's empowering to not know.
it smells right.
It smells
like
right.
It. I like it.
Yeah.
I like it for you. So I'm going to pose our final question now.
Okay. I'm ready.
He's here for it.
I'm here for it.
So imagine that I had a mirror here, and I asked you to hold up that mirror and to gaze into it. Mm-hmm. I love that you're closing your eyes. Really drop in here. So you're gazing in this mirror, and this is a moment for you to remove all external gaze, all external pressures, agendas, expectations, reviews, judgments, criticisms, comparisons, and to just gaze into this mirror and to really absorb that the person reflected back at you has gone through everything that you've shared with us here today and more. All the yous that you have been in your life, staring back at you and taking a moment to say, look at me now. Look at the resourceful, resilient, one and only staring back at me. What do you have to say to that person in the mirror?
Nothing. Because it's already been said.
Beautiful.
Yeah. That I don't have to say. It's just a knowing. It is a silence. I don't have to say anything.
I love that.
Yeah.
Nobody's answered that way before, nor would they, because this is so uniquely you, and I love it. Very monk-like. Way to go.
That was a beautiful question.
You've reached some level of enlightenment here, embodied enlightenment.
I don't know about enlightenment happens moment to moment.
Well, it just happened right here, right now, and I was witness to it. So thank you. Gosh, I feel like we could probably record like a whole side podcast.
After you read the book, then we'll do another one.
I think we should totally do that.
Let's do that.
And maybe we'll just start a whole like second podcast.
Yeah.
And then maybe we'll title it "What's on Your Hat." Holy shit, we're alive.
Holy shit, we're alive.
We got to just zoom in on that hat.
Yeah.
I am so eternally grateful, humbled, inspired by our conversation, and thank you so much for being here.
This has been so great. Honestly, like you never know. And oftentimes I'm like, I'm just so sick of myself. And this was just a beautiful, beautiful conversation.
I'm so grateful. So grateful to have had it. And just watch out, worlds, because this guy's star is fucking on the rise. I mean, you would think like, oh, I've already like won an award from being on the cover of National Geographic, but like it's just skyrocketing. Like the trajectory is enormous. Like we were so lucky to get him off of his world tour. But where can everybody find you? Because everybody needs to be in your world.
Oh, that's sweet. Thank you for asking. Well, the first, like, Instagram, it's just at Cory Richards,
yep.
Cory Richards. And really the place to find me right now is what I would ask is, and it's hard for me to ask, is go buy the book.
Yeah.
It's on Amazon.
I'm going to buy it.
The Color of Everything.
Let's go. I'm literally, the second we stop recording, I'm going to buy it.
Well, I love that. And leave a review.
Buy them both, by the way.
Buy them both. They are an ecosystem. If you have both of them, that's the cool thing is you're reading the memoir and it'll reference photos and you could actually open Bipolar and look and find that photo because they really, one is like the internal exploration and the other is the external manifestation of that and what it created. And so, yeah, that's what you can do. That's where you can find me right now.
Brilliant. And we are going to do another podcast because they need to be autographed.
Yeah,
I'm not having an unautographed copy.
We'll put them right here on the table in between. We're
going to do a thing. We are going to do a full thing.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being here. We're going to link everything in show notes as well, everybody. And I mean, F it. I'll see you on Cory's Instagram.
Yeah, you will.
Bye, y'all.
See ya.
Join us for Look at Me Now, wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to share, like, and subscribe.